It was supposed to be just another day. The hospital corridors were buzzing with the usual chaos. Doctors rushing from one room to another, the occasional beep of heart monitors, and the distant murmur of worried conversations. But for Sarah, none of it mattered. She sat frozen on the cold metal chair outside the billing office, staring at a piece of paper that held the cruelest truth she had ever seen. $204,780. That was the cost of keeping her 6-year-old son Ethan alive. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers over the bill, her vision blurred with unshed tears. She had known this moment was coming, but seeing it printed in black and white felt like a death sentence. Ethan had been diagnosed with a rare heart condition 8 months ago, and the doctors had made it clear. Without a transplant, he wouldn't survive past the year. But transplants weren't handed out like charity, and neither was the money to pay for them. Sarah had already sold everything she could: her car, her jewelry, even the small house she had inherited from her mother. It wasn't enough. The receptionist's voice was polite but firm. "Ma'am, unless the full payment is made within 72 hours, we'll have to discharge your son." The words echoed in her head, a cruel reminder of the reality she was trapped in. Sarah wanted to scream, to beg, to plead with the universe to give her just one miracle. Instead, she let out a shaky breath, forcing herself to stay strong as she walked back toward Ethan's room. She paused at the door, steeling herself before stepping inside. Ethan's small figure lay curled up in the hospital bed, tubes running from his tiny arms, the machines beside him beeping steadily. He turned his head when he saw her, his face lighting up with a weak but genuine smile. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a smile. "Hey, sweetheart, how are you feeling?" He gave a small shrug. "Tired, but I had a dream last night. About flying. I was a superhero just like Iron Man. I had a rocket on my back and I could go anywhere I wanted." His eyes sparkled for a moment before he sighed. "I wish I could really fly." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "You will, baby. You'll fly higher than anyone else." She gently ran her fingers through his soft curls, memorizing every detail of his little face, afraid that time was slipping away faster than she could hold on to it. She didn't know that somewhere in a glass-walled office thousands of miles away, a decision was being made that would change everything. In a sleek minimalist room in Austin, Texas, a Tesla executive sat at his desk, scrolling through a list of flagged charitable requests. He had seen hundreds of them, families pleading for help, children in need of surgeries, communities struggling to rebuild. But there was one entry that caught his eye. It wasn't even an official request, just a tweet. A hospital staff member had posted an emotional plea about a young boy named Ethan who needed a heart transplant. The tweet had barely gained traction, lost in the sea of online noise. But somehow, it had reached one particular person's inbox. The executive stared at the email's subject line: "Urgent, anonymous inquiry for medical fund." He hesitated for a moment before clicking it open. There were no fancy introductions, no long-winded explanations, just a single-line request. "How much is needed to cover all pending pediatric transplants at this facility?" The email had no sender name, just an encrypted domain linked to a private charitable fund. But the executive knew. He had seen this pattern before. Elon Musk had done it again. For years, Musk had been making anonymous donations through multiple channels, carefully hiding his identity. Hospitals, refugee centers, disaster relief funds, money would appear out of nowhere. No media coverage, no credit taken. Most billionaires made grand gestures in front of cameras. Musk operated in the shadows, leaving only whispers of his generosity behind. The executive wasted no time. He immediately forwarded the request to the hospital's finance department. Within hours, the funds were wired. The total amount? Not just enough for Ethan, but for 6 other critically ill children whose families had been facing the same nightmare. Back at the hospital, Sarah had no idea that while she sat in silent despair, a miracle was unfolding in the background. She was jolted out of her thoughts when a nurse walked into Ethan's room, her face unreadable. "Mrs. Carter, could you come with me for a moment?" Sarah's heart pounded as she followed the nurse down the hall, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Had something gone wrong? Had Ethan's condition worsened? When they reached the billing office, the hospital administrator stood waiting. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Was it pity? Sympathy? Then, in a voice almost too calm, he said, "Your son's surgery has been fully covered." Sarah blinked, not understanding. I don't... What? "The full payment has been made." An anonymous donor stepped in. Her legs felt weak. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. Who did this?" The administrator shook his head. "They don't want to be identified." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, a choked sob escaping her lips. She had spent months fighting, begging, losing hope, and now, just like that, the impossible had become real. Ethan was going to live. She ran back to his room, falling onto the chair beside his bed, clutching his tiny hand. He looked up at her, confused by the tears streaming down her face. "Mommy, what's wrong?" She laughed through her sobs, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Nothing, sweetheart. Nothing at all." Outside, life went on as usual. The world kept spinning. But somewhere, in an office where innovation and technology were shaping the future, a man who had spent his life building rockets and electric cars had, with a single stroke of a pen, given a little boy the future he never thought he'd have, and he would never ask for anything in return. The news of Ethan's life being saved had barely settled in before another ripple spread across the medical community. But this time, it wasn't confined to just one hospital. Thousands of miles away, in a pediatric oncology ward in Cape Town, South Africa, a doctor named Dr. Amelia Jacobs sat at her desk, rubbing her temples as she stared at the long list of unpaid medical bills piling up. The hospital was underfunded, the government's financial aid was inconsistent, and parents were being forced to make impossible choices between affording basic necessities or their child's chemotherapy sessions. It was a brutal reality, one she had been fighting for years, but every day the battle seemed more impossible to win. And then, just when hope was beginning to fade, an email landed in her inbox. The subject line was simple: "Pediatric oncology, outstanding bills cleared." At first, she thought it was a mistake. Hospitals didn't just get emails like that. She opened it hesitantly, her heart pounding, and as she read the short message, she felt her breath hitch. "An anonymous donor has covered all unpaid pediatric cancer bills. No media involvement required. Kindly ensure immediate patient continuation." She read the words again, then again, her mind struggling to grasp the weight of what she was seeing. Her hands trembled as she quickly logged into the hospital's finance system, and there it was, an incoming transaction. An amount so large it nearly covered all pending treatments for the next 2 years. No sender information, no foundation name, just a blind trust account wired from an offshore entity. It was a miracle wrapped in silence. The administrator walked into her office moments later, looking just as bewildered. "Did you see this?" he asked, still staring at his phone. "Who would donate this much money and not even want credit for it?" Dr. Jacobs didn't have an answer, but deep down, she knew this wasn't just an act of philanthropy. It was something much bigger, something intentional, something that had been happening in different corners of the world, yet somehow always escaping public attention. A few months later, a similar event occurred in New York. A hospital executive at Mount Sinai received an anonymous donation large enough to wipe out the medical debt of dozens of children battling rare diseases. Then, in India, a small rural clinic in Rajasthan suddenly found itself funded for advanced medical equipment it had been requesting for years. A refugee medical camp in Syria reported that an unknown donor had fully sponsored emergency surgeries for children injured in the ongoing conflict. The pattern was undeniable, and yet no one could trace where the money was coming from. Investigative journalists from major outlets picked up on the trend, and some tried to follow the money trail. But it led them through a maze of private trusts, encrypted financial transactions, and offshore foundations designed to shield the donor's identity. The deeper they dug, the more the mystery grew. Whoever was behind this didn't want recognition, didn't want headlines, didn't want their name attached to any of it. It defied everything the world had come to expect from billionaires, who often made grand public gestures of philanthropy for PR campaigns and legacy building. This was different. This was silent. This was intentional. And then, the first real clue surfaced. It wasn't from an official source, nor was it from an intentional leak. It came from an ex-Tesla financial officer, a man who had been recently terminated for alleged mismanagement of company funds. In an attempt to discredit his former employer, he leaked internal documents that he believed showed questionable financial activity. But what he unintentionally revealed was something else entirely. Among the files was a series of unexplained transfers made through subsidiary companies, all leading to various humanitarian and medical initiatives. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars had been moved over the years, but the most shocking part was the sender's identifier. It wasn't labeled under Tesla, SpaceX, or any corporate entity. The identifier was simple: EM Foundation. It didn't take long for journalists to put the pieces together. EM. The initials were impossible to ignore. Elon Musk had never publicly announced any personal foundation of that name. There was no website, no public records, no annual charity reports, but the numbers didn't lie. The funds had been traced, and the scope of the impact was larger than anyone had realized. Over the past decade, billions had been quietly funneled into medical care, disaster relief, and direct patient assistance. It wasn't just for one hospital, one country, or one specific cause. It was global, it was systematic, and it had been hidden in plain sight for years. The reaction was immediate. News outlets scrambled to verify the findings, yet every official inquiry was met with the same response: no comment on private charitable matters. When reporters confronted Musk himself at a Tesla event, asking him if he was behind the anonymous donations, he simply smiled and walked away. No denial, no confirmation, nothing. And yet that silence spoke louder than words. The world had seen billionaires donate before, but never like this. Never without the flashing cameras, the press releases, the grand speeches. Why? Why would someone so deeply scrutinized, so constantly under the public eye, choose to do something so monumental yet refuse to take credit for it? Theories began circulating, but those who knew Musk well had a simple answer: because it was never about the recognition. A former SpaceX engineer who had worked closely with Musk recalled a conversation from years ago. He had once asked Musk why he didn't promote his charitable efforts like other billionaires. Musk's response was short but revealing: "If you're doing it for applause, you're doing it for the wrong reasons." That was the moment everything made sense. This wasn't about legacy or ego. This was about efficiency, about impact, about making real change without distraction. Musk knew that true philanthropy didn't need a name attached to it. The lives saved, the futures restored. That was the only validation that mattered. Yet, even as these revelations spread, the donations never stopped. More hospitals reported sudden, unexplained funding for critical cases. More families found out their children's treatments had been fully covered by an anonymous benefactor. Musk never spoke about it, never acknowledged it, and perhaps that was the most extraordinary part of all. Because in a world where every act of generosity was turned into a media spectacle, he had chosen to remain silent. He had chosen to let his actions speak for themselves. And somewhere, in hospitals across the world, parents held their children a little tighter, knowing that a stranger they would never meet had given them the greatest gift of all: time. In the grand scheme of the world's wealthiest individuals, philanthropy had always been a carefully orchestrated performance. Press conferences, social media announcements, photo opportunities with oversized checks, and a relentless need to be seen as charitable. But Elon Musk had never followed convention, not in business, not in innovation, and certainly not in the way he gave. The more the world uncovered about his anonymous donations, the more one question began to surface: why? Why would a man whose every move was scrutinized by the media, whose name was synonymous with billion-dollar ventures, choose to give away such vast sums of money without ever attaching his name to it? The answer wasn't found in his companies, nor in any official statements, but in the fragments of his past, in the moments that shaped him long before the world knew his name. Musk's childhood was far from the life of privilege one would expect from a future billionaire. Born in Pretoria, South Africa, he grew up in an environment that was both emotionally and physically isolating. His father, a complex and often domineering figure, had built a successful engineering business, but his personal life was riddled with turbulence. Musk, introverted and fiercely intelligent, spent much of his early years lost in books and computers, often retreating into the words he created in his mind rather than the one that surrounded him. School was no refuge. If anything, it was worse. He was bullied relentlessly, not just teased but brutally beaten by groups of boys who saw his quiet nature as an easy target. On one occasion, they pushed him down a flight of stairs, leaving him hospitalized for days. The emotional scars ran even deeper. For years, Musk learned that drawing attention to himself, especially in vulnerable moments, only made things worse. He learned to work in silence, to push forward without expecting sympathy, to achieve without the need for applause. But the real shift came not from the pain he endured, but from what he witnessed around him. Apartheid South Africa was a place of stark contrasts, extreme wealth coexisting with gut-wrenching poverty. Musk, as a child, saw it firsthand. He saw families barely surviving, children his own age begging on the streets, hospitals overflowing with the sick and injured who had no means to afford care. While his father dismissed these realities as just the way the world worked, his mother, Mae Musk, instilled a different lesson in him. "The world doesn't need more talkers. It needs doers," she would tell him. It was a phrase that would embed itself deep in his consciousness, a philosophy that would shape every decision he made. If something was broken, you fixed it. If someone was suffering, you helped them. Not for recognition, not for validation, but because it was simply what had to be done. Decades later, when Musk had climbed the impossible heights of success, building PayPal, founding SpaceX, revolutionizing electric cars with Tesla, he found himself in a position where he could do what most people never could. He could fix problems at a scale no one else could imagine. But unlike his billionaire peers, he had no interest in turning it into a PR campaign. He had seen how charity was often used as a branding tool, how donations came with strings attached, how philanthropy often meant establishing a foundation that spent more on administration than actual help. He wanted none of it. His philosophy was simple: give quietly, give effectively, and give without ego. The stories that surfaced about his anonymous donations were just the ones that had accidentally come to light. The truth was, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of instances where Musk had stepped in, unseen, unheard. Hospital CEOs who had received anonymous funding were bound by strict non-disclosure agreements, ensuring that even if they suspected who the donor was, they could never publicly confirm it. But whispers spread. Doctors recalled late-night phone calls from a deep-voiced man who asked only one question: "What do you need to save them?" One surgeon in California remembered an urgent pediatric case where a child needed an experimental surgery not covered by insurance. Out of nowhere, a donation arrived, covering not just that surgery but 10 others. When a hospital administrator tried to reach out to the donor, they were met with a single instruction: no press, just save them. Another instance came from a disaster relief organization working in Haiti after a devastating earthquake. With hospitals overwhelmed and resources dwindling, they had put out an urgent plea for funding. The usual response time from donors was weeks, sometimes months. But within 24 hours, a single donation had covered their entire operational costs for the next 6 months. No name attached, no press release. But financial experts later traced the source, another one of Musk's quiet interventions. One of the few public glimpses into his philosophy on giving came from a rare interview in 2016. A journalist, probing into why Musk never seemed to announce major charitable contributions, asked him directly, "You're worth billions. Why don't you donate like other celebrities?" Musk's response was simple but revealing. True charity isn't about attention. If you're doing it for the cameras, you're not really doing it for them. It was a statement that baffled many, especially in a world where the wealthiest individuals often sought validation for their generosity. But for those who knew Musk personally, it made perfect sense. He wasn't interested in optics. He wasn't interested in feel-good headlines. He was interested in the results. In one of the few times he had spoken about philanthropy at all, he had once mentioned that the problem with traditional charity was inefficiency. Too much money was lost in bureaucracy, in middlemen, in PR campaigns that were more about reputation than actual impact. His method was different. It was direct, immediate, and most importantly, anonymous. Because the moment you remove ego from charity, it becomes about the people who need help, not the person giving it. Yet, even as these stories began to surface, Musk refused to acknowledge them. Reporters asked, and he said nothing. Investigators traced donations back to him, and he remained silent. While other billionaires built charities with their names etched in gold, Musk continued to operate in the shadows, changing lives without demanding gratitude. And perhaps that was the most extraordinary part of it all. Because in a world where generosity was often a spectacle, where philanthropy was treated as a brand-building exercise, he had chosen a different path. He had chosen to make a difference without asking for recognition. He had chosen to let his actions, not his words, define his impact. And somewhere, in hospitals across the world, in disaster zones and refugee camps, there were people who would never know his name, but whose lives had been saved by a man they would never meet. And for Elon Musk, that was enough. The hospital room was silent except for the steady beep of the monitors that surrounded Daniel's bed. He had spent more time within these walls than outside them in the past year. And yet, despite the sterile air, the cold fluorescent lights, and the endless stream of nurses checking his vitals, this place had become his reality, a reality that was quickly slipping away. 17 years old, battling a rare spinal disorder that was slowly stealing his ability to move, to breathe, to live. The doctors had told him the truth in the kindest way possible, but no matter how softly they spoke, their words had landed like bricks on his chest. Without the experimental surgery, his chances of survival beyond 18 were slim. His body was shutting down, little by little, and time was his biggest enemy. He had tried to stay strong for as long as he could, pushing away the fear, burying the nightmares that came each night. But the weight of it all was suffocating. He had never known the comfort of a real family. His earliest memories were of different foster homes, different faces, different promises that always ended in disappointment. He had learned early on not to expect anyone to stay. When he was diagnosed, the system did what it could, but medical bills piled up quickly, and soon, he found himself alone in the fight of his life. The surgery he needed wasn't covered by state aid. The price tag was staggering, $500,000, a number so impossible that it might as well have been a death sentence. But Daniel wasn't the kind of person who gave up easily. He had fought his entire life to survive, to be seen, to be heard. And so, with nothing left to lose, he picked up his phone and did the only thing he could think of. His fingers trembled as he typed the words, not from weakness, but from the sheer absurdity of what he was about to do. Elon Musk, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need your help. Without this surgery, I won't live to see my 18th birthday. He stared at the tweet for a long moment before pressing send, half expecting the universe to laugh at him for even trying. He knew how Twitter worked. It was a place where millions of voices screamed into the void, most of them never getting an answer. What were the chances that someone like Elon Musk, one of the busiest, most famous men in the world, would see a desperate plea from a nobody like him? The rational part of him said it was hopeless. But in the quiet part of his heart, he still believed in miracles. The next 2 days were torture. He checked his phone obsessively, refreshing his notifications every few minutes, searching for any sign of a reply. Nothing. The tweet gained a handful of likes, a few retweets, some strangers sending well wishes, but the one response he needed never came. He knew it was foolish to hope, and yet each hour that passed without an answer felt like another nail in the coffin. By the third day, reality settled in. The money wasn't coming. He wasn't getting the surgery. The world was moving on, just as it always did. He had spent his entire life being overlooked, and this was no different. And then, just as he was beginning to accept his fate, the call came. It was early morning when the hospital administrator walked in, his face unreadable. Daniel had seen that expression before, the kind of carefully measured neutrality that doctors used when delivering bad news. He braced himself, expecting another rejection, another reminder that his time was running out. But the words that came out of the administrator's mouth were something else entirely. "Daniel, I don't know how, but your surgery has been fully paid for." The world stopped. For a moment he thought he had misheard, that maybe his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The full amount, $500,000. It's been covered by an anonymous donor." His heart slammed against his ribs. His mind raced, struggling to process what he had just heard. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He had spent months hearing the same answer over and over again. No money, no surgery. And now, out of nowhere, someone had paid for it? He swallowed hard, his voice shaking. "Who?" The administrator hesitated before shaking his head. "They wish to remain anonymous." Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. He had suspected, had hoped, but he needed to be sure. Did Elon Musk do this?" The administrator's lips pressed into a thin line. "I can't say." But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken, something that told Daniel all he needed to know. Tears welled up in his eyes as the weight of everything crashed over him. He had spent years believing that no one cared, that he was just another name lost in the system, another case that would be forgotten. And yet, somewhere out there, a man who had never met him, who had no reason to care, had changed his life with a single act of kindness, not for publicity, not for recognition, just because he could. News of the donation spread quickly. The media picked up on the story, speculating, analyzing, trying to piece together the mystery. Journalists reached out to Musk's team, but as expected, the response was the same. No comment on private charitable matters. The internet was flooded with theories, some claiming it was a coincidence, others arguing that Musk had no reason to hide his generosity. But those who had followed his quiet philanthropy over the years knew better. This was exactly how he operated. No fanfare, no cameras, just direct, immediate action. Days later, as Daniel lay in the recovery room, his body still aching but his heart beating stronger than it had in months, he picked up his phone once more. He opened Twitter, staring at the old tweet that had almost faded into oblivion, and then, with a deep breath, he typed a new message. "I don't know who did this. I don't know if you'll ever see this. But if it's who I think it is, thank you, Mr. Musk. You didn't just save my life. You showed me that there are still good people in this world." There was no response, no acknowledgement, no grand reveal. But Daniel didn't need one. He had already received the answer he was looking for. And somewhere, in an office filled with blueprints for Mars colonies and electric cars, a man glanced at his phone, saw the message, and with a small, knowing smile, put it down and got back to work. Because for him, saving a life had never been about the thanks. It had always been about the act itself. The Tesla Gigafactory buzzed with energy, the air thick with the hum of innovation, and the quiet murmurs of investors, engineers, and employees moving through the massive facility. It was a day meant for celebration, a new milestone for electric vehicles, another leap toward the future. Elon Musk stood at the center of it all, effortlessly shifting between discussions about sustainable energy, autonomous driving, and the complexities of battery production. His mind was always operating in multiple dimensions, processing numbers, engineering challenges, and business strategies all at once. But amidst the technical brilliance of the event, a moment unfolded that no one had planned for. One that had nothing to do with technology or business, yet would become one of the most impactful moments of the day. It started as a minor disruption. A woman, her face lined with desperation, pushed through the gathered crowd, her voice rising above the chatter. "Please, let me through. I just need to talk to him." Security reacted immediately, moving to block her path, their training kicking in to protect the high-profile billionaire from what appeared to be an overly aggressive attendee. But this was no ordinary interruption. This was the cry of a mother on the edge of despair. "My son is dying," she gasped, struggling against the firm hands trying to hold her back. "Please, I just need a miracle." The words cut through the noise like a blade. For a moment, time seemed to pause. Musk, who had been engaged in a deep technical discussion with one of his engineers, turned his head toward the commotion. His eyes locked onto the woman, and something in her voice made him raise a hand, a simple, unspoken command for security to let her approach. She stumbled forward, breathless, her hands shaking as she clutched a crumpled envelope in one hand. Her clothes were worn, her face pale from exhaustion, and the weight of her anguish was almost tangible. "My son, he's only 8, she choked out, barely able to get the words past the lump in her throat. "He needs an urgent surgery, but the hospital won't operate without full payment. I tried everything. Loans, charities, no one is helping. I have nothing left." She thrust the envelope toward him, her last shred of hope contained within the wrinkled paper. It was a medical bill, an astronomical sum far beyond the reach of an ordinary person. There was no hesitation in Musk's response. He didn't ask for details, didn't request verification, didn't pass the issue to an assistant to deal with later. He asked only one question. "What hospital?" The woman blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "UCLA Medical," she whispered, her voice cracking. Musk nodded once. "Consider it done." He turned to one of his aides, who immediately understood. This wasn't a request. It was an instruction. Within minutes, a quiet series of calls were placed, strings were pulled, funds were transferred. By the time the event was wrapping up, an executive from the hospital was already reviewing a sudden, unexpected 7-figure donation that had just appeared in their account. The instructions attached were simple. Immediate use for all critical pediatric cases. No media, no publicity. The mother, still reeling from the surreal nature of the encounter, was escorted out of the event by a Tesla employee who assured her that everything was being handled. She didn't dare to believe it. Not yet. She had spent months fighting, hearing nothing but rejection, feeling doors slam in her face. How could something this monumental happen in a matter of minutes? But then, her phone rang. When she answered, the voice on the other end nearly brought her to her knees. "Ma'am, I don't know who you spoke to, but your son's surgery has been fully covered. You don't owe the hospital anything." She collapsed into a chair outside the gigafactory, tears streaming down her face as she sobbed into the receiver. The words didn't seem real. The relief was overwhelming, suffocating in its intensity. "Are you sure?" she whispered, still unable to process the enormity of what had just happened. "Yes, ma'am," the hospital administrator said, his voice just as stunned as hers. "And not just for your son. Several other children on the waiting list. Their surgeries have been covered too." She pressed a hand to her mouth, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about her son. Musk had done what no one else had. He had seen the problem and fixed it, not just for her, but for others who had been trapped in the same hopeless cycle. And he had done it without hesitation, without conditions, without any expectation of gratitude or recognition. The news never made headlines. There were no tweets, no articles, no statements from Musk himself. The only reason the world ever found out about the incident was because one of the Tesla employees who had witnessed it firsthand couldn't shake the memory of it. In a quiet conversation months later, he mentioned it to a journalist, who then spent weeks trying to verify the story. But by the time they attempted to confirm the donation, there was nothing left to trace. The transaction had been routed through a blind trust, the hospital had been instructed to remain silent, and any attempt to link it directly to Musk was met with dead ends. When the journalist finally confronted a Tesla executive about the event, All they got was a cryptic response. Let's just say, someone very powerful was listening that day. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement they would ever receive. For Musk, it was just another moment, another decision among the thousands he made every day. He had built a reputation on solving impossible problems, whether it was revolutionizing space travel, creating sustainable energy solutions, or preparing humanity for life beyond Earth. But the most remarkable thing about him was that, even in the midst of shaping the future, he never lost sight of the individuals struggling in the present. He had the power to change lives with a single decision, and he wielded that power with a level of humility that was almost unheard of among the world's elite. To him, this wasn't about charity, it was about efficiency. A life needed saving. He had the means to save it. So he did. It was that simple. The mother never got the chance to thank him personally. She tried, reaching out to Tesla, sending letters, but there was never a response. At first, she thought it was because he didn't care, but the more she learned about the man who had saved her son, the more she understood. Musk never did things for recognition. He didn't need to hear the words "thank you" to know he had made a difference. He had been shaped by a world that often overlooked the suffering of the less fortunate, and instead of accepting that as an unchangeable reality, he had chosen to rewrite the rules. Somewhere in the world, a little boy who had been days away from losing his future was now running through a park, laughing, playing, completely unaware of the moment that had saved his life. And that, more than any applause or media coverage, was the only reward Musk had ever needed. The world had spent decades trying to define Elon Musk. To some, he was a visionary, a man who looked beyond the present and saw what humanity could become. To others, he was an enigma, a figure of controversy and contradiction. Billionaire, genius, disruptor. Labels were constantly thrown at him, each one attempting to capture a fragment of a man who refused to be boxed in. But there was one part of his life, perhaps the most extraordinary of all, that no one could quite pin down: the quiet donations, the silent life-saving interventions, the acts of generosity that never made headlines, that were never turned into PR campaigns. And no matter how many stories surfaced, no matter how many lives were changed by his unseen hand, Musk himself never spoke about it. There was no grand announcement, no acceptance of gratitude, no acknowledgement of the millions, possibly billions, that had been funneled into saving children, supporting hospitals, and rebuilding communities in crisis. It wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he cared too much to make it about himself. People close to him had always known that Musk despised inefficiency. Whether it was in engineering, space travel, or business, he believed in cutting through the unnecessary and getting straight to results. And that belief extended to his philanthropy. Most billionaire charities followed a predictable pattern: large foundations with extravagant events, red carpets, and gala dinners where the ultra-wealthy wrote checks while cameras flashed. Money was raised, speeches were given, and yet, more often than not, the funds were swallowed up by administrative costs, legal fees, and bureaucratic red tape. Musk had no patience for that. To him, the equation was simple. If someone needed help and he had the resources to provide it, there was no reason to delay. He didn't need committees to approve donations. He didn't need his name on hospital wings or scholarships. He didn't need a legacy built on charity, because to him, charity wasn't about the giver. It was about the people who needed saving. That was why, when a Tesla shareholder once asked him on a conference call why he never publicized his charitable contributions like other billionaires, his answer was blunt and unwavering. "I don't want to be another billionaire who does it for PR. The point isn't for people to praise me. The point is to save lives." His voice had been calm, unbothered, as if the very idea of needing recognition for doing the right thing was foreign to him. The response had baffled many, because in a world where billionaires spent fortunes shaping their public image, Musk's refusal to play the game made no sense. But to those who had benefited from his silent generosity, it made perfect sense. He wasn't interested in applause. He was interested in impact. There were stories that never made it past whispers. A little girl in Lebanon, trapped under the rubble of a collapsed building after an explosion, was flown to a private hospital for emergency treatment, the entire cost mysteriously covered. A struggling robotics student in Brazil received a fully funded scholarship to one of the world's top universities, the payment routed through an untraceable donor. A doctor in a war-torn country found his clinic suddenly restocked with life-saving supplies, delivered by a humanitarian organization that couldn't identify who had funded the mission. The common thread in all these stories was that the money came from nowhere, yet always arrived exactly when it was needed. And each time when someone tried to follow the trail, it always led to dead ends, blind trusts, anonymous accounts, encrypted transactions. But those who had seen the pattern knew. They knew who was behind it. And yet, when confronted, Musk would only offer a quiet smile and change the subject, as if the matter was too trivial to discuss. Investigators who had spent years trying to estimate the total amount of Musk's secret donations had only been able to scratch the surface. The figures varied, but some reports suggested the number was staggering, possibly over 250 million, maybe more. Yet for all the efforts to quantify his impact, there was one undeniable truth. Not a single dollar had ever been credited to his name. No tax write-offs, no branding, no awards. Just action. Direct, immediate, and untraceable. The realization of this left many in awe. Philanthropy in the modern world had become a spectacle, a stage for the wealthy to display their virtue. But Musk had removed himself from the equation entirely. He had flipped the very nature of giving on its head, making it about the people who needed help rather than the one providing it. For the families whose children had been saved, for the patients who had received life-saving treatment, for the students who had been given a future they never thought possible, Musk remained an unseen guardian, a presence that existed only in their prayers and gratitude. A father of a child whose medical bills had been mysteriously covered once said in an interview, "My son is alive today because of a man he will never meet. That, to me, is true kindness." Those words spread like wildfire, not because Musk acknowledged them, but because they captured something rare in a world driven by self-promotion. True kindness, the kind that expects nothing in return, the kind that seeks no validation, was something most people never witnessed in their lifetime. And yet here was a man, one of the most influential figures in modern history, who embodied that principle without ever needing to be seen doing it. Even now, as these stories surface, Musk remains silent. There is no attempt to confirm or deny, no desire to shift the narrative. He continues to push forward, focused on Mars colonization, artificial intelligence, and solving the energy crisis. Yet, behind the scenes, his silent philanthropy continues. More lives are saved, more futures are rewritten, all without a single headline carrying his name. Because in the end, for Musk, the greatest impact isn't measured in applause or admiration. It's measured in the quiet moments, in the hospital rooms where a mother learns her child will live, in the classrooms where a student is given the chance to dream bigger, in the unseen corners of the world where hope appears in the form of an anonymous donation that changes everything. And so, as the world debates his legacy, as critics analyze his every move, as journalists continue to search for answers, Musk remains exactly as he has always been. Silent in his kindness, relentless in his vision, and indifferent to the credit that so many others would demand. He has built rockets, cars, and technologies that will shape the future, but perhaps his greatest legacy will never be known, never be recorded in history books. It will live in the lives he has saved, in the futures he has quietly rebuilt, and in the hearts of those who will never know his name but will forever be touched by his unseen hand. If this story has shown you anything, it's that true generosity isn't about recognition. It's about making a difference when no one is watching. And maybe, just maybe, that's something we can all learn from. Because kindness in its purest form doesn't need a name. It just needs action.